Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about consensual non-consent. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Angelique Luna. Angelique uses she, her pronouns and is a sex and relationships coach, educator, and podcaster. She helps people confidently communicate their sexual needs, wants, and desires. Her podcast, Sex Positive Me, discusses all aspects and effects of sexual relationship. Her mission is to educate, entertain, empower people to have the best sex life. So Angelique, thank you so much for being here today on the podcast.
It is such an honor to be interviewed with the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. I respect your work. I'm a full supporter. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And I know that you also donated to the VSC in the past, and we just really appreciate your support and love all the work that you're doing as well. So I'm super excited to have you on today. And I also have returning Danielle Simpson-Baker. So Danielle uses she, her pronouns and is a crisis counselor and victim advocate at Victim Service Center of Central Florida. Danielle recently graduated with a master's in marriage and couples therapy from UCF or the University of Central Florida, and is currently a registered marriage and family therapy intern. She is also working toward a dual certificate in sex therapy and education. She provides free and inclusive sex education and advice on her Instagram page at the Sex Pot Therapist, which we'll put in the description. So Danielle, thank you for joining us again. It's great to have you as always on the podcast.
Of course, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And thank you so much, Angelique, for all your support with Victim Service Center. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to have this conversation with both of you. So as a brief introduction, we talk a lot about consent on this podcast, as understanding it is really key to preventing sexual violence. So today we are joined by two amazing individuals to discuss consensual non-consent, rape culture and ways to combat it, communicating our needs and boundaries to our partners, and how different ways survivors can feel empowered and heal. So with that, as always, I think it's super helpful to start off with some definitions, I should say. So this is the first one I'm going to go with. So how would you define what a kink is?
I would define kink. It is something that gives you pleasure and turns you on. It may not be traditional from other people. Kink is often used fluidly in the community, in the professional mental health. And Danielle, correct me if I'm wrong. Kink is also a way to describe a sexual activity versus like fetishes that people think that you are fetish and kink are the same. They're a little bit different because with a fetish, it is something that you need to have in order to have an orgasm or in order to get off. So with a kink, it's just like an addition, something non-traditional, such as like a toy or a activity, maybe being an exhibitionist. That's a kink. Things that, are outside the realm of traditional sex activities. Danielle, what's your definition?
Yeah, I think you definitely hit the nail on the head. I was going to say pretty much all the same thing. Yeah, for me, a kink is basically anything that falls like outside of the realm of like quote unquote vanilla or normal sexual play, which I'm sure just by that definition, you can see how it opens you up to a whole world of what could be kinky. But yeah, it's a variety of things, just like Angelique was saying. It could be just enjoying certain body parts, role play, like Angelique said, even just using a toy can be a kink. And I'm really glad that you made that distinction between kink and fetish, because I think a lot of the time people do lump the two together. But yeah, I would agree with you 100%. I think a fetish is more of something that you kind of like, it's like kind of a requirement and like maybe a standard for your play. I think even more like specifically or like literally defined, a fetish really has to involve like a certain object or something like that. So like a foot fetish, a smoking fetish, a leather fetish, whatever kind of fetish it is. But yeah, fetish is a little bit more, I would say a little bit more intense than a kink sometimes, just because of that requirement. And I would say sometimes people might even say that a fetish could be a kind of kink. So yeah, kink is definitely more of an umbrella term.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. So would you say that kink can be an umbrella and then under that would be fetish, or is that incorrect, assuming that?
No, it's actually is correct. I'm just trying to keep it as low level instead of going into the full detail of the umbrella, because then we'll be here just explaining all the various different types of kinks that's under that
Exactly.
umbrella, than versus focusing on our consensual non-consent conversation.
I
Right.
appreciate that. No, I appreciate that. So with that, yeah, let's keep the ball rolling here because we only have so much time, right? And easily you can see how many podcasts can come out of just one question. So when we were planning this podcast, we talked a little bit about negotiations. So what exactly are negotiations and why are they important when it comes to consent?
Negotiations are very important. We often hear the words traditionally in like a business sense or like a contract when you're buying a house. We don't think of negotiations when it comes to personal, intimate space. We think it's like, oh, just like the media shows you, we get together, do it, and there's no communications. God bless 50 Shades of Grey for coming out and showing us everything that is wrong in the situation, to have us backtrack and say, well, you have to communicate and negotiate. What is it that you're desiring to do? What kind of play? Is it, do you want to go on a romantic date, then come back for some intimate Netflix and chill? Or what are you wanting to explore and do? And then also during your negotiations, what kind of trauma issues you may have. And that also goes for your body. My example, my neck surgery. I always tell people stay away from my neck. It's very delicate to me. And that's something I bring up in my negotiations. I'm a type 2 diabetic. Have candy and sweets afterwards, after our scene, our playtime. So that way, in case my sugar drops, because once you've done heavy activity, sugar goes down. And these are things that you go back and forth. Maybe one partner may be interested in some impact play, and the other partner is like, I'm kind of on the fence. I'm not sure. I've never tried it. Okay, let's start small. What are you comfortable with? And trying to make each person's voice valid, whatever their choice and desires of intimacy is. And again, it could be penetration, it could just be snuggling. Whatever it is, you negotiate those scenes. And then afterwards, you also negotiate your aftercare. What is you desire to be? Just like, give me my Doctor Who blanket, leave me in the corner until I come back. Or, you know what, hold me tight until I come back to space. Again, these are things that are negotiated and discussed. Similar like business and real estate transactions. You have to consider yourself very important and valid to have an amazing experience, as long as you communicate and consent with each other's needs.
Oh my gosh, so well put. Oh my God, I learned so much from that. Essentially, just kind of saying that, yeah, absolutely, you deserve to communicate your needs. That's what this is really all about. And I love that you gave those really specific examples of those needs. Like, the fact that you would appreciate some candies after or something like that, depending on your needs and desires. And you're allowed to ask for those things too, right? Danielle, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to jump in on.
Honestly, no. I think that was so comprehensive and perfect. You didn't, because I have like my notes here. Like I go through and answer all the questions all the time when you send these. So you didn't say anything that I wasn't going to say. So that was perfect. Yeah. And I love that you mentioned specifically like what aftercare can look like, ranging from like cuddling to like just leaving your partner alone. And I think that's something that we kind of like don't normalize after having sex or after just engaging in any kind of play, because, you know, people just assume that you want to have someone touching you and cuddling you. So I'm happy that you mentioned that, like, if that's what y'all agreed on, that you want to leave each other alone, and that's totally fine. That's what aftercare looks like for you.
Totally.
The best analogy I always give to a lot of my vanilla clients, like are still, you know, transitioning into non-traditional relationships. It's like, think of it like a game. You know, we watch the soccers, we watch football, Super Bowls, baseball. Every time you're watching these sporting events, at the beginning, there is the pre-show. They're telling you what's going to happen, who's going to do what, all those details. Then the game happens. And then there's an after show pre-game wrap up. Okay, this is what happened. This could have been better. This could have made that. Apply that same philosophy to your sex life and watch it change dramatically, because now you're seeing the value of what a pre-conversation negotiation is during the activity or the scene of what is going on, and then doing a wrap up afterwards. And it's like, okay, this is what I like. This is not what I like. Let's what we could do better. So in putting that in that mentality, people are like, whoa, it's like their minds are blown. And I'm like, simple common sense.
I love that analogy. That's so perfect. Love it.
Absolutely. And speaking of like the game or the show that you were mentioning, the scene itself, you mentioned about aftercare, but during it, what about check-ins? What exactly does a check-in look like, and why are they important?
For me, check-ins, they can kind of happen at any time before, during, or after play. But I think they're basically what happens when you take a moment to kind of ask your partner how they're doing, if they're enjoying what's happening. And it kind of allows both you and your partner to say, I love what we're doing, but let's try it like this, or I would prefer this. And it doesn't have to be like a formal, like, okay, timeout, like stop the whole scene. It can be kind of like worked into it. It can be something that's just kind of like, you can make it sexy or just like really in tune with what's going on. Like, how does that feel? Or should I keep going? Stuff like that.
Not only with check-ins, check in on the negative, but check in on the positive. Check in on, hey, are you enjoying it this? Would you like me harder, softer, lighter? You know, especially in some of the BDSM kink scenes, there are scenes that there's no verbal communication. So make sure you have something like, we have a racquetball or tennis ball. No, I can't remember the name. A lacrosse ball. Sorry, lacrosse ball that I'm holding in my hand. And if there's something wrong, I drop it. So that's how my partner can check in on me that something's not right. Because again, some of the activities that you may be playing, you may not have a voice to say something. So you must come up with some kind of body cues to communicate with your partner and say, yes, this is good. No, this is bad. Stick to something simple, red, yellow, green, to check in. It's like to say, hey, this is going well, this is not. And again, it's nothing that has to be like a big formal, like hard stop. It's just like you could seductively just whisper in their ear and say, hey, how am I doing? How are you doing? What do you need? What do you desire? You know, things of that. Again, don't overthink it. Please keep it simple.
Absolutely. And I think that at the end of the day, you know, check-ins are so important. And also, as things kind of progress or change, it's important that those are communicated, right? But of course, that would be ideally at the beginning. But that's why check-ins can always be there as well. I feel like consent is happening, like you were mentioning, at the beginning, during, and after as well. It's completely part of the entire process. So you mentioned a lot about a scene. So what are the boundaries of a scene? What exactly is a scene, or what could a scene look like, or the boundaries of it?
So for me, a scene is the active playtime. So that's when the kinks and fetishes, intercourse, if that's included, are actually taking place. So if you want to think of it like a play, a scene, or if you want to think of it like a play or a movie, whatever, a scene is kind of what happens after you say action, right? So and boundaries, they can be as loose or as specific as you both agreed upon during the negotiations. So it really could look like a lot of things. It just depends on exactly what's happening, what you've all agreed to, what your expectations are. So yeah, and I think that's another reason why negotiations are so important.
One of the things in regards to a scene and the boundaries is like consent can be revoked at any time. Once someone says stop or no, that's it. The scene is over. It's done. Everyone has a voice in it. It's not like the top is in control and the bottom is, or dominant or submissive. Everyone has the power to stop the scene, because people just assume, and this is the bad part, because of like what media and the society has taught us, it's like, no, only the top and the dominant has the power. No, the submissive has just as much power and the bottom has just as much power. Once they say stop, that's it. So don't ever feel like you cannot speak up. Always speak up. And especially if you're doing anything in the BDSM, fetish, power exchange community, always speak up. Use your voice.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was just like nodding as you were talking, like, yes, anytime. You can stop at any time, and everyone has the power, to consent and withdraw consent at any moment. Speaking of which, I wanted to dive a little deeper into a specific kink that we're going to be talking about today, which is consensual non-consent. So how would you define it? And then why is it important that the word consent is first here?
Sure. All right. So consensual non-consent is also known as rape play. It is essentially a kind of role play where one partner, at least, is not consenting, quote unquote, to sexual intercourse. But it's very important to keep in mind that this is all a part of the act. It's all a part of the role play. And it is a very specific role play, obviously. So yeah, it's just an agreed upon thing, that the roles you're playing during that scene is that one person is not consenting to the act and the other person is kind of forcing it. And of course, I think for obvious reasons, it's essential that the word consent comes first, because for me, when you hear the word non-consent, that completely erases any context of consensual and therefore enjoyable sex. It's completely taken out of the situation because it's not consensual. That's not what it is. So the word consent needs to be first, because it kind of implies that certain negotiations have taken place, certain boundaries are set in place for this kind of scene to happen. And calling it consensual non-consent is just, that there's a difference between rape and then consensual non-consent. Consensual non-consent is a type of kink role play, if you want to call it that.
Yes, it's actually a role play, because sometimes sex is not even involved. It's just a violent act.
Exactly.
That somebody would like to see it. So these are things that are negotiated, discussed. The traditional no stop may not apply in consensual non-consent, because the negotiations may have changed to a different word, that they might say something like Africa or Jamaica or something different than no or stop or please or any of that, because the negotiations has described that these are words I want to yell and scream, and I'm okay with doing that, but does not mean to stop the scene.
That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like those check-ins can maybe happen as well during.
Correct. But it is trying to create a check-in that would still keep the scene going on without any disruption. Mm-hmm. Like a traditional scene, like we're intimate in the bedroom, would be like whispering and touching or, mm-hmm. talking, versus if you're in a heavy, violent scene, you still want to keep up with the violence, but you want to check in. You have to figure out what are the words to say. Do we still continue? Is it agreeing, or do we do I stop right now? Is it red? So again, it's what you enjoy. So saying that you being thrown in the trunk of a car, you could check in and say, going in the trunk. And if she or he yells, no, no, then that means yes, continue. Or if they may say the safe word of Jamaica, then that's it. We stop. So again, it is being very detailed in your negotiations. Again, it's like writing a script, writing everything that's going on, what details, because you don't want to disrupt the mood. You don't want to disrupt the whole mindset of it, because in the kink community, it is a mind altering experience that you're releasing yourself.
Yeah, I think that the negotiation part and understanding exactly the communication piece to it and communicating it is super key here, because of course, at the end of the day, we want to make sure everyone's safe. And I also wanted to kind of shift the conversation a little bit to rape culture. So how would you define rape culture? And the reason I'm bringing it up is because I wanted to see if you can consensual non-consent actually contribute to rape culture?
So for me, rape culture refers to any environment, idea, or like even society where the prevailing attitudes of its people kind of like normalize or trivialize sexual abuse and assault. So to me, that includes enforcing ideas like victim blaming, sexual shame, sometimes purity culture, very largely the lack of comprehensive consent and pleasure-based sex education, and I will die on that hill. And yeah, just things like that all contribute to rape culture. So in that sense, I do think consensual non-consent can kind of contribute to it, especially when we consider how a lot of people aren't taught about kink. They're not taught about what boundaries and negotiations and all that stuff looks like. And maybe a person who hasn't had that kind of education or any like just notion of those ideas, they might have it in their head, well, if you like something like consensual non-consent, how could you ever be a rape victim or survivor? Because if you would let that happen to you, then, you must like it or you must not care. So of course, in that way, I think consensual non-consent can contribute to rape culture, but I still think the bigger issue there, again, is that lack of, comprehensive sex education and just like learning about all the things that come with kink and all the things that come with a kink like consensual non-consent.
I know this is a really big question, but really that's why we had this podcast essentially. So I wanted to see, Angelique, did you have anything that you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything Danielle said. That's why I'd rather have her talk more, because, she has her degree and, so people could understand that the psychology of these role plays that can contribute to misinterpretation of, well, the media says it's okay because they enjoyed this. And then also, we're not taught boundaries. No one teaches us boundaries. We're forced to do things that we don't like to do since the age of childhood.
Exactly.
How often are we like pushed to go hug Aunt Mildred, who smells like cigars and booze, because we don't want to embarrass our parents? Okay, that's like the first lesson of consent. That's why I totally believe in age appropriate sex education. And the thing is, we say sex education, people automatically think penetration, penis and vagina. That's what they think. And that's why we get this rape culture, because we're not taught boundaries. We're not taught consent. We're just forced into an area that, well, there you go, run loose. That's why I don't know the statistics, but I know like your first couple years in college, that's very common to get raped, because that's what they see on the media. That's what they assume. We're free from every rule there is, but does not even acknowledge that the other person has feelings. The other person is human. Maybe they do like rough sex, but there's like a whole negotiation list of what they like and what they don't like. And then you need to know that to grow and evolve and trust people, because if you don't, then you're putting yourself in a very dangerous situation. So it is very adamant that consensual non-consent, the whole sentence stays together, because you are giving willful, knowledgeable consent to do the things that you're doing that is may consider rape culture, but we need more education out there to really get people to understand that, yes, this can happen, but there's rules to go with it. Like there's rules to drive the road. There's rules to go out in public, the society laws. But when it comes to sex, yeah, not so much, we're just anti everything, anti-sex. It's like, no, let's talk about pleasure.
Yeah, I agree where, because of the shame around the subject, and we talked a lot about this in our sex positivity podcast, because of the shame around it, people aren't talking about it. And so people aren't taught how to talk about it and express their needs. It sounds like, because the next question I had was essentially, how can it, or is it able to, or how can it be practiced in a responsible way that does not contribute to rape culture? So it sounds like education is a really big piece to it. I also am wondering if this is kind of an advanced kink, like if someone's getting into kind of the community and exploring, this might be a more advanced one because of the nature of the negotiation and making sure that we're not crossing any boundaries. Would you agree to that?
I definitely would agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Just because with this kink, it's complex because I think with any kink, a lot of things could come up mentally for a person. But I think especially with this one, especially if you're someone who has been through any kind of sexual assault, there are things that can come up when you're engaging yourself in this kink. And it can be a very serious reaction a lot of the time. Just down to, having your body kind of react in a way that you weren't expecting, or maybe you might dissociate during the scene in a way that you weren't expecting. So I think if you haven't done a certain kind of just some level of trauma work, even if it's just something as simple as recognizing what your triggers are and how to stop them or cope with them in the moment, this could be a very tricky kind of kink to engage in. So it's definitely not something I would recommend going into as soon as you start exploring your kinky side. It's not something I would recommend going into if you haven't done a little bit of work on yourself, because it can just be more damaging than beneficial for you if you haven't made yourself aware of certain things that are going on within yourself.
And on the flip side, it can be empowering if you have
For
done
sure.
your healing and you could be in control because you have negotiated every detail possible.
Mm-hmm.
This is why, it is a more advanced experience kink, because you need to know how to communicate. You need to know if you could trust the people that you're playing with, that you need to know if they've been vetted. And vetted is like the other people would say, yes, this person's a good person to play with. Yes, you could respect them. These are things that someone new will not think these questions out. They would just like, I want to experience it. Okay, like, hold up, let's go back. Let's start with the psychology of this. Are you mentally stable to do this type of play? Because when you do any type of BDSM, kink, fetish, your mind, and it's been like done in x-rays, things, goes into a different chemical space. So you may not be able to consensually agree to someone if you're in subspace, because the chemicals, the dopamines, the serotonins, and all oxytocins all have exploded. And it's similar to a drug-induced high, but it's all natural. Your body will naturally produce these, hormones and, chemicals in your brain to make you feel good. And if you're not in control of that before entering these kinds of negotiations, you're just opening a recipe for disaster. So it's one of those things. Really know yourself, know your body before entering any type of like BDSM and kink scene, because your body has a great memory and will trigger and react however it needs to protect you. It's just an automatic defense that your body does. And you might not think it's like, why don't I have control? It's your body. It's like a lot of times there's maybe trauma that you totally blocked out from your mind, but your body will remember and will react to it. So that's why we always say this is for the more advanced experience. So that way they know they could check off everything on the negotiation list of what they're saying, what they're desiring, what may come up, what may not come up, and how to handle it. That's the other thing you need to say. It's like, okay, hey, if I just start shivering and Cole like pet my head and tell me I'm a pretty girl, that's an example of like handling that trigger. So you need to know that before entering any of these types of play.
Absolutely. And on the other side too, absolutely communicate what you're desiring and know that another person may have different desires, and you don't have to consent to that if you're not comfortable with it too, right? Like it doesn't mean that you're going to have the same desires as someone else. Everyone's different. And that's okay. So I'm really glad that you brought up this idea of empowerment. And I'm actually going to just jump ahead. I will go back to the other questions too, but just for the flow of it. I wanted to see if you wanted to hop in on this too, Danielle, as well. But how can exploring sexuality without shame be empowering for survivors and beyond? And why is empowerment important, especially in this context?
So I honestly, this is another thing, Angelique, I think you really said it all with this one. But I think we get a lot of messages from society that tell us that we should be ashamed of our bodies and what they can do and just sex in general. So I think just, taking those messages and kind of silencing them by actively exploring your body and actively finding out what's pleasurable for you and what's exciting for you and what your sexuality means for you, that can just be empowering in itself. Just because you're not allowing society to tell you what you should and shouldn't do with your body, and not allowing society to make rules on what is pleasurable for you, or what sex can be for you, whether you want it to be strictly for pleasure or strictly for having children, or both, or none of it. Of course, I think as long as you're kind of making your own rules about it, that's what can be empowering for a person, for a survivor, or anyone really.
I love that. And why is empowerment? We bring it up all the time in our podcast. So why is empowerment so important for survivors of sexual violence and trauma specifically?
For me, I would say sexual assault is something that can really rob a person of their autonomy, and especially sexual autonomy, because, for a moment, you were kind of robbed of that control of your body, even though you said no. Someone, violated that and kind of took it from you. So empowerment is really something that we kind of, we have to make sure that that's part of what we're talking to our clients about. From the first time we meet them on the phone, scheduling their intakes, or scheduling them for exams, just to every single counseling and therapy session. It has to be ingrained in everything, because it's something that's kind of taken from you. That empowerment is something that's taken from you. So I think every interaction, at least that I have with my clients, I'm trying to help them get a little of that back, which is a big reason why I even got into this kind of work. So I think empowerment is essential for this context, especially.
Oh, and see, a lot of my clients, I'm like forcing them to give themselves permission. That's the thing they have to understand. You have the permission to pleasure your body however it is. You have the permission to create and design the relationship, whatever it is, as long as it's communicated and consensual. People need to understand you don't have to wait until society tells you that it's okay to be happy with your body and happy with yourself. So I'm like, how many mixed messages do we get from body shaming, body fat, you look a certain style, dress a certain style? I mean, it's so overwhelming, consumed, that we don't know how to make ourselves as individuals happy first. And having our own sexual empowerment gives us a freedom of release, of being in control of our own body, mind, and spirit. Because sometimes it doesn't even have to be physical. It could be a spiritual awakening, doing deep meditations and breathing. That is sexual freedom right there. So again, it is thinking outside of the box, telling the rest of the world to go F themselves, to be polite, and saying my body, my autonomy, my happy, my pleasure. That's what I teach a lot of my clients. And a lot of them, are afraid to speak up. And I'm like, why? You could tell somebody that they did something completely wrong, but when it comes to your pleasure in your body, you can't say anything. And that was like one of the reasons why I went down this line of work. I went into it to like make sure it's like, no, 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 no. You have a voice. Let's use it. Let's use it for pleasure. Let's use it for your sexual empowerment and not give your power up to anybody, anyone else. And yes, you could have boundaries and people will respect them. And if they don't, it's okay to say goodbye.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I love that you said give yourself permission to be happy, and bringing in all those different like pieces that we're getting from society that's telling us like almost like we're not allowed to be comfortable in our own skin. And we absolutely have permission to be that, and also have permission to communicate our boundaries. And yes, have the power to walk away if they're not being respected. You talked a little bit about why you got into this, Danielle. So I wanted to ask a little bit about, you are the victim advocate at the VSC, but in addition to that, you are also a sex therapist. So I think we've been kind of talking a little bit about sex therapy, but I wanted to see if you wanted to dive in a little bit more. And then again, what made you interested in working with survivors in addition to that?
Sex therapy is another kind of talk therapy, but the main issue you're addressing with the client is usually some kind of sexual related issue. So it could have to do with sexual dysfunction, concerns with sexual desire, gender identity, concerns with your sexual identity, or even sexual shame. So stuff like that. It can be a whole bunch of different things, but there's usually an underlying sexual issue. So it's definitely not having intercourse with your clients in any capacity. That is a huge misconception about sex therapy. There are somatic sex therapists, which means that they're a little bit more hands-on. They do work more with the body. And then there are also surrogates who actually do have intercourse with clients, but it's usually never the therapist that's doing that. The surrogate or the somatic therapist might be more like an auxiliary kind of service that the sex therapist might work with. But typically traditional sex therapy is talk therapy. And honestly, the reason why I got into or wanted to work with survivors, it was a combination of my own personal experience as a survivor and just knowing that for many survivors, like I said before, autonomy is something that you're kind of just robbed of after a sexual assault. And especially that sexual autonomy can be hard to get back for some people. Now, of course, there are people who can experience a sexual assault and they don't have any changes in their sex life, or maybe they might have sex more than usual. But for a lot of people, it's kind of hard to feel at home in your body after something like that, let alone feel comfortable in it sexually, or even feel like you can enjoy sex after something like that. Like I know for some people, it's almost like you feel like you shouldn't enjoy it, or like there's something wrong with you for enjoying it. So that's just something that I wanted to help people work through, especially with all the trauma that certainly comes after that, because of, as you talked about, or maybe as I've heard talked about on the podcast before, trauma can certainly have some pretty significant effects on the brain. So combining that with, again, just like the messages we get about sexual shame with society, it can be a very complex thing to work through. So that's why I wanted to get into this line of work.
I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Danielle, and sharing your experience as well. And just thank you for everything that you do for survivors, not only that come through the VSC, but also on your Instagram as well, the empowering messages that you send. Seriously, y'all, if you have not been on her Instagram, please check it out.
Thank you.
It's amazing. And I wanted to also ask you, Angelique, if you're comfortable, what made you interested in advocating for survivors? I know that you're a big advocate for the VSC.
Yeah, actually, mine is actually secondhand survivors. Remember how we always said like we do the right thing of doing things for others so they don't look bad. I had that situation with my daughter's, I'm just going to say sperm donor, who actually, his father is the one who sexually assaulted my daughter between the ages of 3 to 8. And it was very traumatic because I did do what society said, be the nice little Mexican girl, share the child custody, even though we never got married, not ever once realizing the damage that was being done to my daughter and the communications, because they threatened my daughter to never tell me. If they did, they would kill me. So it wasn't until we started going through our own little healing trauma, because it was actually finally caught on video at a local community pool here in Central Florida, that I got that call of that grandfather and a granddaughter are in inappropriate behavior in the pool. And my whole life devastated. I was just like, okay, pick up the pieces. I've been very blessed to believe in mental health since the age of 15, because that's when my first attempt at suicide. I've done a couple others, but I've always gone back to mental health. I'm a firm believer in mental health therapy, and believe in being confident with your sexuality. And, at that point, we went through our designated healing. So we had to do individual, family, and group counseling or peer counseling. My daughter was able to do all three, not a problem. I am myself, unfortunately, am a bisexual swinger. So I had to go through 4 therapists before I found a therapist that was going to help me with the healing of losing my daughter's innocence versus trying to fix me as a bisexual swinger. Different levels, different things. Then I went to the peer counseling, and I just realistically say, hey, these kids are between the ages of 7 and 10. We got to get them prepared mentally and emotionally when they get to middle school and high school, because they're going to have sex. It's just the way society and nature is. I was asked to leave and never return, because I could even see the parents in the room cannot even talk sex with their own partners. We're talking spouses, married. I'm like, you can't even talk sex within each other. How I know that these kids are going to be healthy growing on, because again, they were even, fighting to go into mental health. That was another thing. I was one of the first and only parents, and we're talking 15 years ago, that demanded to put my child in therapy. I'm like, she's gone through a traumatic event. She needs to go to therapy. It's like most parents say no. I'm like, my answer to them, they're idiots. That was my answer, because they need to heal. They need resources. They need to get this out. So that's how my journey started, that I said, I might not be the only one going through this that needs more continual support. So I started blogging, and the blogging eventually ended up to be a podcast. Then eventually I got my Kink Aware certification. So I am more of a sex and relationship coach that helps people work towards their future goals, work forward, versus Danielle works to fix the past. With talk therapy, I'm working forward to help them heal and go achieve the goals and sexual desires that they want, and relationships. That it's okay that monogamy is not your only option. There is like a whole sundae bar that you could choose from: hot fudge, vanilla, scoops, all that. I teach that to give people the safe space to be their authentic self, to know that there are options. So that is why I created the podcast, which has now evolved into a weekly radio show. I'm available for coaching. I teach classes at our local sex positive store here. Available for that, because I want people to have the best sex life that they can, even after a traumatic area, or even have somebody that they could talk to say, hey, how do I handle this? Because honestly, even now in 2021, there's still more resources for the survivors versus their secondaries, their partners, their parents. There's still not enough resources for people like myself. And I try to help them out and hold their hand. And it's like, hey, it's a roller coaster ride, but it's worth it. I mean, God bless my child now is 20 something and acting like a normal 20 something year old child, and not someone that's been a survivor. She might start talking about it, but if you interact with her, she doesn't have any of those syndromes.
First off, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so, so sorry about what happened to you and to your daughter. I'm so grateful that you were able to find the services that you needed. I'm so sorry that when you did so, there were some like misconceptions and forced things in a supposedly safe space. But I'm so glad that you advocated for yourself and knew like, no, this isn't right for me, and finding a new, new service and everything. And you brought up being a secondary survivor. So definitely one of our podcasts actually is all about that. Because we understand that secondary survivors are also impacted by the trauma tremendously. And I don't know, Danielle, I know this isn't on the list of questions, but I don't know if you could talk a little bit about the services that we provide for survivors and secondary survivors.
Of course, yeah. So we offer a whole bunch of services, all free of charge, including counseling, therapy, safety planning. We do offer forensic exams for survivors up to 5 days after an assault occurs. So that's definitely one of the biggest services that we offer, as well as moral support during the exam. We also help survivors apply for victims' compensation, but we also refer out to other services as well. But yeah, if you look us up at victimservicecenter.org, you can see all the services that we provide to both survivors and secondary survivors.
Yeah, I think that what's super key is kind of what you were already saying, Angelique, too, or there's some services that just, they're not there for secondary survivors and they need to go through their healing path as well, just like survivors, of course. So I'm really grateful that we're able to provide like one-on-one counseling and family counseling for secondary survivors, as well as like there isn't a secondary survivor support group yet, but maybe there will be. But there's also other support groups too. So
I think we're working on one for secondary survivors, I think.
I would love that. That is so helpful and needed for sure.
And judgment free from the kink community, because that was my biggest issue. And we're talking 15 years ago when I went through it. I mean, it may have gone better, may not, but that was one of the reasons why I got my certification, because I was extremely upset that there was not enough kink aware professionals to help me, because we have still the same issues as everybody else. We just have a different lifestyle.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up again, because I wanted to circle back and talk about what are some of those common misconceptions that you may want to address when it comes to consent and the BDSM/kink positive community.
Wow, that's a whole loaded question there, because it's just people not understanding the lifestyle, not understanding what kind of emotional, mental, and spiritual release the kink lifestyle presents. Because I do have some clientele that, they're top executive CEOs, CFOs of their companies, and they like to be brought down to like a submissive level and have everything taken care of, because it's a mental release, because in their daily life, they're in control of everything. They're in control. They have to like manage everything, and they just want someone to take care of them. And oftentimes the partner may not understand. What do you mean? You still got to do this. And I was like, no. I need a release. It is a release of normal day-by-day activities. Polyamory is the biggest misconception of all of it. It's trying to understand, how can you be in love with more than one person? Only one. And I'm like, no. That is what society has trained us. If we go back to ancient times and ancient civilization, indigenous, it was always a tribe. You loved each other. You supported each other. There was not this one-on-one monogamy. That started way back in the like medieval times for property. You married another person in exchange. Love and relationships has only been around for less than 300 years. Think about it. We only married for love in 300 years out of how many thousands of years we've been around as humans? It's like, these are the psychology things that people misconfuse based on what society has taught us, what is normal in a relationship between, sorry to sound like anti-gender, but man and woman, heterosexual, cisgender, that's what it is. It's just within the last century that we have evolved to include different types that unfortunately have been under the radar, have been underground. And we've had these relationships for many, many years, from LGBTQ and to BDSM to kink. We could go back to find that. And like I said, whatever religion, society, family has put in our head, in reality, it's not who we are. and we change and we evolve, and we could be attracted to many people. We could have many relationships, could be emotional, non-emotional. Again, it's just understanding that we still grieve, we still mourn loss, we still have trauma and heartaches, things that, again, not traditional relationships have. We still have those same ones. One of the case studies I did when I first started was a triad, husband and wife and a girlfriend. Husband passed away, left the ladies in distraught. The girlfriend went to seek counseling, was calling a couple of counselors. No one understand. One counselor, one therapist actually said, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. You're too effed up. So, and messed up. I can't help you." I'm like, she was looking for resources to help process the grief of losing her loved one, even though it wasn't a husband, but it was a boyfriend, part of a triad, and she lost the relationship because the wife no longer wanted to continue. That's still grieving. You need services.
Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing all of that. I think that what you said earlier on about people having the power to live their authentic selves, whether that means polyamory to them or monogamy to someone else, whatever that is to someone, you have a right to live your authentic self. So absolutely, I appreciate you sharing all of those kind of misconceptions. And I'm sorry that individuals that you faced certain things and challenges and barriers because of those misconceptions. Kind of shifting gears a little bit here, back to kind of like consent in the scene. So if someone does decide to change their mind during a scene or play, how can they actually communicate that to their partner? Or if something is triggering for a survivor all of a sudden, how can they communicate that as well? We talked a little bit about certain things that we could do, like safe words and things like that, but I didn't know if you had anything that you wanted to add on to it. If no, that's fine.
I'll let you take this one, Angelique.
No, I think we covered it. It is, again, going back to knowing your body, knowing yourself, and during your negotiation, saying exact words that you will use in order to stop the scene. Again, we teach the basics because that's entry level, a lot of the clientele that we do. But if you get more advanced and words that you can use and you can remember during the scene, then do that. You need and to understand what is going to happen during a scene. Are you going to be able to verbally communicate? If not, what is your backup plan? Is it raising your arm or putting it down, or dropping a ball? Again, be very detailed in your negotiations when you're doing a scene, so there is no mishaps or something may derail and take you out of that mind space, because it is, putting you in a different place in your mind that sometimes you may be conscious, sometimes you may not, but you're enjoying the moment. You really want to make sure you're safe by covering all your bases and knowing all your medical health, your triggers, what they need to do, what in case of emergency. Is there a person that they could contact? Are they going to be there when you're having your scene, or do you have to call them up? And then if you have to call up, for example, any like paramedics or emergency, does your play partner know your medications, know your health? You cannot just go into playing with somebody and just automatically say, "Oh, well, I'm a type 2 diabetic and I'm on Ribelsin, so you knew that was going to be this." No, they didn't, because you never brought it up in the negotiation. So you have to be very detailed. That's why it does take time, because we're taught not to speak up about our pleasure. We're taught not to speak up and talk about sex. So getting into this lifestyle, boy, you better have a very vocal voice in telling, this is what I like, this is what's wrong with me, this is how you take care of it, and this is how you handle it.
It's like learning about yourself and like knowing your triggers and coming at it from that point and then communicating it. And you said like getting really, really specific. And, within the context of the work that we do at the VSC, Danielle, I wanted to see what would you say to a survivor who maybe they want to like disclose and talk about a little bit, like, this is a trigger for me. What would you say to a survivor who isn't sure when they should disclose, or if they're not sure if they should at all? their sexual trauma to their intimate partner. And of course, Angelique, you can jump in after as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a common issue that survivors have. And I would say that there is no right way to say it unless it's right for you, unfortunately. And I hate to give such a catch-all answer, but that's really the truth. I mean, everyone's healing path and journey is going to be different. Everyone's situation is different as far as how severely the trauma has affected you. So those are the kinds of things that are going to make a difference in when you decide to tell them versus if you even want to decide to tell them. So I would say don't feel like you have to, don't feel pressured. If you do feel you're pressured from your partner, then maybe that's a different conversation to have with your therapist and or your partner, because that's not something that you should feel pressured to talk about with anybody if you're not ready to. And if you feel like you are ready, I would say maybe try and have a kind of like role play with your therapist or someone else that you trust beforehand so that you can kind of maybe map out what you want to say, try and prepare for different outcomes from your partner, stuff like that. But it's definitely not something that you should feel like you're on a timeline to disclose or that you should feel pressured to disclose.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you talking more.
And
I love the idea of like doing the role play with your therapist as well. And then of course, knowing when you are ready and not feeling that pressure. Angelique, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
No, it boils down to trust. And the first person you need to trust is yourself. That's what you need to understand. Going into any of this kink or BDSM play, you need to trust that you're going to able to speak up and say, stop, speak up and say, this is what is triggering me, and speak up and say, this is all the challenges. And once you trust yourself, then you're able to trust another person. And whoever that other person is, like Danielle said, you could trust your therapist and go over what is it that you're desiring to explore, and then figure out who is it you want to explore it with. It may not be your actual intimate partner. It may be another play partner. You have to understand vocabulary is everything when you're going into this. And please be clear and concise and on the same page with the person you're playing with in regards to what is going to happen in the scene. Because again, your body might freak out. And if you don't know what that is, then you're not trusting your body. There's no way that you could trust somebody else to know what they do, because it may be a partner that you've been with many years, or it could be a brand new partner. But you're the one who needs to trust yourself, trust what your mind, your heart, and your spirit are telling you in order to continue to heal and empower your sexuality and your exploration.
Absolutely. I love that. And, I wanted to talk a little bit about your podcast, Angelique, just kind of from the framework of if someone would like to learn more about this, where could they go?
Our podcast is available on all podcast platforms. It's Sex Positive Me website. We also have a YouTube channel. We do have a radio show on BFAM 109.6 that broadcasts live every Monday at 2:30 p.m. And that is all the sex positive education. If you want to know about crazy adventures and ask questions and Q&A with us, we do have Date Night with the Lunas at 7:00 also on BFAM 109.6, which also broadcasts live on our private Facebook group and YouTube channel. But always feel free to reach out directly. I'm available to help you out however I best can, so everyone has the best sex life possible.
Thank you so much, Angelique. And Danielle, I don't know if you had any resources, or you could talk about your Instagram, of course, as well, as far as kind of places people can start if they want to learn a little bit more.
Sure. So yeah, I'm always available on my Instagram. That's primarily where I do a lot of my like creative work. And I like Emilie said earlier, provide free inclusive sex education. I create just like content talking about all different kinds of topics having to do with sex education, sex therapy, relationships. I'm also available as a sex coach, so you can reach out to me on my Instagram if you want to learn more about that. But yeah, that's where you can find more about me.
That's so awesome. And I learned so much from both of you. And I really thank you so, so much for being here today. But before we sign off, is there anything else that you'd like to say, maybe to the survivors out there, or anything you'd like to address that we might have missed?
Just remember, it's your body, and you could do whatever makes you happy and pleasurable. And know that there's always resources available to help you with your journey.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful place to sign off. So thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so, so much, Danielle. And thank you so much, Angelique, for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you so much. I appreciate you both.
Thank you so much. I appreciate both of you ladies. I appreciate any time sharing my story.